It's been 30 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law, protecting people with disabilities against discrimination. Mark Greenfield is an experienced consultant and award-winning speaker who's been helping colleges and universities improve their websites and digital properties for 30 years. Much of that time committed to web accessibility. He joins Newspoint today for a look back and a look ahead to what the future holds for accessibility as we embrace new technologies. Mark, thank you so much for joining Newspoint today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
What exactly is the Americans with Disability Act, and why must organizations care about it?
So the American with Disabilities Act, which was signed in 1990, is a really important piece of civil rights legislation. And I think that's what's important to remember, that the ADA is about civil rights and human rights that in the United States impacts over 60 million people. And if people want a good introduction to how the ADA came to be, I would recommend watching a documentary that came out in March called Crip Camp. It was actually produced by Barack and Michelle Obama, and it really highlights the struggles that people had to bring the ADA into being. It's a really wonderful documentary, and I would recommend everybody watch that. So in the course of my consulting work, I get asked a lot about why does the American with Disabilities Act matter? And there are really four primary reasons that organizations need to think about the ADA. The first is legal compliance. It is a law that everybody is required to follow. And over the past few years, we have seen quite an increase in the amount of litigation happening around the ADA. In 2019, there were 11,000 cases brought in federal court related to the ADA. Of those 11,000 cases, about 2,500 were specifically related to web accessibility. So it is something that legally every organization needs to be thinking about. Even if there was no legal requirement, there are a lot of other reasons why this matters. And, first of all, it impacts about 20% of the population. So when we're talking about people with disabilities, it's a variety of disabilities, including visual disabilities, such as being blind or having low vision. It's auditory disabilities, people who are hard of hearing or deaf. It is motor disabilities where somebody physically can't get around, or in the case of the web, might not be able to use a keyboard and mouse. And then the final category, which is one a lot of people don't think about, are cognitive disabilities. So people with learning disabilities, those kinds of things. So when you take all of that together, it impacts about 20% of the population. And as the population grows, or as the population gets older, that number is only going to increase. So it really is important in terms of the number of people that it impacts. The third reason is that when you address accessibility issues, especially in the digital world, you're actually making the user experience for everyone much better. And a good example of this is with closed captioning. So all of us are familiar with television closed captioning and can imagine if you're deaf or hard of hearing how important that is. But research has shown that 85% of the people who use closed captioning are not deaf or hard of hearing. They're either in a loud, noisy bar where they can't have the TV sound turned up, or they're in a library where the sound has to be turned off. So when you address, accessibility issues, you are often also addressing just the usability and user experience for everyone. And then the final reason, and to me, one of the things that every organization needs to think about, is what I call organizational social responsibility. When you think about accessibility and the ADA, it really is just the right thing to do from both a moral and kind of ethical perspective. And I've seen a lot of organizations who have started to address this, even in mission and vision statements, where they are explicitly saying that they want to talk about inclusion. And one of the things I like about my position at the University of Buffalo is that I work in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So my role really isn't, as a web accessibility officer, really isn't about technology. It's about inclusion. And I think that really sends the right message.
Well, as of the end of July, we're now 30 years into the ADA. What's the report card on ADA, and what could we be doing better?
So as I thought about this, I would give our response to the ADA a B. I think we have made really good progress, but right now, even though it is a legal requirement, I think there's still a lot of change that has to come in society in terms of how we think about people with disabilities and really thinking about inclusion. So while we have made progress, I think there's a lot more work to be done. There has been a lot of information over the last week about the ADA, given the 30th anniversary. And one of the quotes I saw, which I think sums this up really well, is that think of the ADA as the floor, not as the ceiling. So it's where you start, but certainly not where we can go. I think there's a lot more that can be done.
The WebAIM study certainly did point in the direction that there was significant work still to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give a little background on the WebAIM study. So WebAIM is an organization out of Utah State University. They are very well known in terms of providing consultation work and tools to work with web accessibility. And for the past 2 years now, they've been running an automated test of the top 1 million home pages on the World Wide Web. And when they just did this in February, they found an average of 60 plus errors per page for those top 1 million web pages. Now, there's two things to remember. One is that that's actually an increase from when they did the study the year before. There's more errors than there were when they did this a year ago. The second thing is that this was done with automated tools, and automated tools can only find about 30% of errors. So that's not the totality of the number of errors. It's actually going to be much greater than that. So there is certainly a lot of work that needs to be done. And I've been involved with accessibility, digital accessibility for 20 years now. And I am a little bit frustrated that we haven't made more progress and been thinking about why that hasn't happened. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that the importance of accessibility is not emphasized enough with web designers and web developers. And it certainly is a skill set that is really, really important. But when you look at the curriculum on a lot of college campuses, or even with the online resources that people use to learn about web development, accessibility usually isn't mentioned. And if it is mentioned, it's really just an afterthought. So I think we need to do a much better job in terms of thinking about the importance of what I would call inclusive design. And then the second thing is thinking about design in general. And one of the books I recommend that everybody reads is called Mismatch by Kat Holmes. And she's had a lot of experience working with major organizations with inclusion, with accessibility. And what her book does is illustrate two very important points. One is that, and I think this is because of the ADA, we've started to think about disability differently. Traditionally, disability, and if you watch Crip Camp, this is kind of what the frame of reference was back in the 70s, is that you thought about a disability as a medical problem. It was something wrong with somebody. And so that creates a whole paradigm that I think is an inaccurate and not an appropriate paradigm. So one of the things that Kat Holmes talks about in her book is the social model of accessibility, which is really a mismatch between human capability and the environment. So instead of treating somebody as being sick or being, disabled, maybe the better word is handicapped, which you don't hear that word anymore. Think about a mismatch between the physical capabilities and what the environment provides. And related to that, and I think everybody gets taught this, is the idea of an average person or an average user. So whether it's in the physical space when you're designing a car, or, so I think there was a study done on crash test dummies where when you put a crash test dummy, they were all 5'9" and weighed 171 pounds, because that is the size of the average male. Come to find out that females were being injured in car accidents much more than males because of that basic premise that there's an average size. So as they started to rethink that, the number of fatalities with women in car accidents actually come way down. And that's the same thing applies to web development and web design. There is no such thing as an average user. So if you take into consideration the full spectrum of ability and design for that full spectrum, we're going to have much better success.
Well, accessibility certainly helps us all. And with access to technology advancing at breakneck speed, what does the future hold for people with disabilities?
So one of my favorite books was written back in 1995, and it was called Being Digital. It was written by Nicholas Negroponte, who at the time was the director of the MIT Media Lab. And one of the quotes that has stood out for me in that book over the last 25 years is that everything that can become digital will become digital. And he talks about the switch from atoms to bits. So I think about my college experience back in the 1970s, where if I was going to drop in at a class, I would actually have to go get a physical piece of paper signed by the dean. When I first started working at the University of Buffalo, technology advanced to the point where when people needed to register for classes, they would camp out overnight in front of our gymnasium and then actually walk through the gym to get their classes that they needed. Much better than what I had to go through, much more, quickly you could get your schedule put together. But think about how students do it today, where they're in real time registering for classes on their smartphones. So we certainly are seeing that in education, where there is this march from the physical campus to the digital campus. And one of the things I think that has happened with the pandemic is that this has been accelerated tremendously. All of a sudden in education, whether it was K through 12 or higher ed, everything got moved online instantly. The physical world got left behind. The online world was really important. And I think a lot of people were caught off guard about the accessibility requirements around online learning. And it's not just with education. You think about retail, whatever it may be, it's really been an acceleration to move everything online. So I think there is a huge opportunity for us to really dedicate time and effort to making the online experience as accessible as possible. And as that WebAIM study said, on the web piece of things, we certainly have a lot of work to do, but I'm also looking in the future where we're going to be doing a lot more with technology. So I think about things like augmented reality and virtual reality. Think about things like artificial intelligence. And for me, the technology I'm most interested in is voice technology. So all of those have the ability to improve the user experience for everybody, particularly with people with disabilities. And when you think about how you interact with a computer, my first experience with computers was back in 1974, without dating myself. And the way I interacted with a computer was through punch cards. Even when I was in college in the late 70s, there was no computer on our campus. So I would type out punch cards and I would mail them 40 miles down the road to a computer. And that's how I interacted with the computer. You get a printout back from that. Then in the late 70s, early 80s into the 90s, the keyboard and mouse and a computer monitor became the primary way that we interact with computers. But for people with disabilities, that basic interaction has limitations. And I think voice has the potential to completely change how those interactions work. And I'm really excited about where that technology is going. I had the opportunity last summer to speak at the Voice Summit, which was a worldwide gathering of about 5,000 people talking about voice technology. And they actually had a track on accessibility, which I thought was fantastic. And the one thing I like about the people involved with voice technology is they are thinking about inclusion and thinking about accessibility right from the start, and are addressing a lot of issues right from the start, which I think was missing when the web first launched back in the early 90s. So I'm really excited about where that might take us.
Well, we've certainly come a long way in the past 30 years, and CRIPCamp certainly gives a very good description of the history leading to where we are now. As you say, still a long way to go. It'll be exciting to see what the future holds for accessibility. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time with NewsPoint today.
Thanks for having me.